Okay, this is the lecture on obscenity and the First Amendment. I'm going to go through some different aspects than what your readings touch on, but hopefully within this lecture you'll be able to then pull all of the different elements together. You do have three separate parts to this lecture, so make sure you watch all three of these, and then there's a separate lecture on Foucault. Specifically, we're going to start looking at the First Amendment. What does the First Amendment provide for us? There are 5 basic freedoms that are listed in the First Amendment. Most people can get 2 or 3. How many can you list just off the top of your head? We're going to come back to that, see if you think about those. 45 important words. Our First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's the first one, freedom of religion. Prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's called the Free Exercise Clause. Abridging the freedom of speech. So we have freedom of speech. Or of the press. That's our third freedom, freedom of press. The right of the people to peaceably assemble. Fourth, right to assembly and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Notice, however, that all of these apply to the government. And so originally as the Constitution is written, we don't have freedom of speech in the sense of I can say whatever I want. The way that we interpret it now is that whatever we want to say, we can say. There may be repercussions. So for example, if Rush Limbaugh wants to go on his show and say certain things that are inappropriate, he can do that. The repercussions will be people may not want to advertise on his show, etc. The only thing that this protects us from literally is that if I want to say I do not like President Obama, or I have a problem with my senator, or I wish my senator would just quit doing this, or my senator is crooked and I don't like him, I can say those things without fear of someone knocking on the door in the middle of the night and taking me away and me never being heard from again. So that was how it was originally intended, but obviously over the years it has become broadened, and now it is really what we think. When we think of freedom of speech, we can say almost whatever we want, but realize that you do have repercussions. And so the 5 freedoms again: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition the government. So what we're going to be looking at, obscenity issues. This came out of feminist studies in the 1970s. Prior to that, we really didn't focus on obscenity. We're going to see that the definition of obscenity is going to really be established in the United States in the 1970s. It will be refined a little bit, but still what we refer to as the Miller test dates back to this period when feminist scholars in different universities started looking at women's movement, women's voices in literature, arts, film, etc., realizing there was a bit of a problem. There was a lot more of the male voice heard than the female voice. And so they started studying, what does it mean to be obscene? What is obscene? What is obscene to women versus men, different groups, etc.? And from that, we start looking at obscenity issues. Then we have in the 1980s, we have a huge push towards issues of privacy. We have, starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we first have the Constitution coming into conflict with privacy issues with contraceptives. We have a case, Griswold v. Connecticut, where they looked at, do married couples have the right to contraceptives? Connecticut had outlawed them. And when the Supreme Court went to look at the Constitution, we don't have a right to privacy in the Constitution, but they said that behind the scenes, kind of like as a shadow, if you hold your hand up in front of a light, your hand in front of that light would be the actual Constitution, but in the background there's a shadow, and it's in that shadow that certain rights are found. And so in that particular case on contraceptives, the courts found that there is a right to privacy hidden in the Third Amendment, where we can't be forced to shelter men in our home, can't force soldiers in our home during non-war time. And so they said that gives us the right to privacy within our dwelling. And so from there we moved to other issues of things that were appropriate. We have 2 different cases dealing with ostensibly sodomy, gay rights, but it really was dealing with Do you have the right to do what you want kind of in your home as long as you're not hurting people? And so out of those sodomy cases, we end up getting fully the right to, the right to privacy completely understood by all of the court. And then in the 2000s, the court's really starting to have to go back and look at what is obscenity again, because we now have the internet, proliferation of information flowing to and from people. Sometimes you click on something you don't even think is going to be dangerous, and suddenly you get pictures and graphics that you don't really want. And so the courts are having to really look at these different things that are being put out into the public sphere, and how are we going to interpret that? And so it's really from the feminist studies, they really started looking at how do people look at what is obscene, and do different people look at things differently? Privacy rights started to say, do we have the right to do what we want to in our own home? And with the internet starting to look at the proliferation of it being pushed out there, excuse me, for consumption. With freedom of speech, it is the liberty, as I've already went into a little bit, it's liberty to speak and express one's opinion. You don't have the right to say certain things still. You can't say fire in a crowded theater. Well, let me rephrase that. You can, but you'll be arrested. And also, if you do say fire in a crowded theater and someone gets hurt, then you are liable for that. You are criminally liable. And if someone gets killed, then you're liable for murder, since you purposefully went and said something you're not supposed to say. Then there's intent there. And so a lot of things flow from that. So can you say fire in a crowded theater? Absolutely. Is it legal? No. Is it protected speech? No. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at this, is what is protected, meaning when we look at something that some people could say is obscene, is it protected? And will we look at it as art or something different than obscenity? What different types of communications? Face-to-face, me talking to somebody. Internet communications, art, music, clothing. Any type of communication, go Gators, any type of communication is going to be protected. And so that is an important thing to keep in mind, because it can be symbolic communication as well, and that some people may think is obscene, but we still have to put it through the test, because as long as it is protected speech, we will have to put it through the test we're going to learn in just a little bit. I tell you here that it does include the right, it does include the right to criticize public officials, politicians, religious leaders, as well as public corporate policies. And in fact, freedom of speech gives you a little bit more freedom when you're talking about a public figure. So, for example, in just legal terms, if I say something against my next door neighbor, that is slanderous, then there's basically like a 3-step thing that a court looks at, and if I meet all of those, then I am guilty of slander. When you're talking about public figures, a 4th step is added, and you have to show that you're malicious in your intent, and that's really difficult for public figures to refute. So normally, if it's a public figure, someone can say a lot of things about them before you cross the line into non-protected speech. And if you have questions about that, typically it's pretty straightforward, because a person, let's say an actor, puts himself, herself out there in the public sphere. We expect people, and courts expect people, to talk about them. And sometimes you're going to say things that they don't like. And so if that were the case, that they could sue every time someone said something about them they didn't like, our courts would just be clogged. And so the courts said, if you're a public figure of whatever ilk, whether it's politician, religious leader, etc., actor, singer, then as soon as you put yourself out there for public consumption, you open yourself up to being criticized by the public. And as long as it's not a lie, then you're pretty much able to say it. And all of these different policies, the way that we look at free speech, comes out of information that was promulgated by our forefathers, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, etc., built into our Constitution. And they were really influenced by the enlightened thinker Voltaire, who is quoted as more commonly attributed to Voltaire. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And so although we just say the freedom of speech, the idea behind it. So again, if we take the example of me holding my hand up to the light, then my hand is actually saying you have freedom of speech. It's very limited. But when you look at what's behind it, the shadow being cast, it's really this idea of what Voltaire says, that I may not approve of it, but I'm going to allow you to be able to say it because I would rather you say something slightly inappropriate than you not have the right to say it at all. Okay, this is the end of the first PowerPoint. So with this last slide, Federal Communications Commission, I just put this up here to let you know that there's different agencies that are responsible. It's not just courts. When someone has a problem with something that they've heard, seen on TV, movie, radio, then there's different avenues to pursue issues to see whether or not it is obscene. There are certain agencies, such as the FCC, that has been set up by Congress. There can also be different commissioners appointed by the president to oversee and decide whether things are obscene. There's administrative law judges. So there's several different avenues besides going into a court of law. And I've given you a link to a Wikipedia site that just basically gives you an overview of the Federal Communications Commission. I will tell you you're not going to be tested on them. I just want you to have an idea that everything that I'm talking about doesn't always necessarily have to go to a court, but they do have to apply the Miller test that we're going to talk about in the next slide, next PowerPoint.